Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Observer Research Foundation roundtable on a very important topic about dynamics and implications of India's vaccine diplomacy. Uh, it's almost been a year and a half now since we've been designated to small squares on screens as the pandemic spread across the globe. Uh, but at the base of the response from a global perspective, it has been the vaccines that have been developed over the past year and are being now distributed across the world. But there are, of course, bottlenecks, there are challenges, there are geopolitical challenges, there are societal challenges, and there are cultural challenges on how these vaccines are playing a role in society against the pandemic. So to take this discussion forward, we've got a great panel today, and we'll very quickly introduce them. We've got Oomen Kurian, who's a senior fellow at the Research Foundation and the head of ORF's Health Initiative. We've got Sohini Bose, who's a junior fellow at ORF. We've got Sriparna Banerjee, who's also a junior fellow at ORF. And we've got Kalpat Mankikar, who's a fellow at ORF in Mumbai. So welcome to everyone. Woman, I'm going to start very quickly with you. As I said, we've all been stuck within this pandemic for a fair while now, and the response has been trickling in. There are millions of people now vaccinated, but now we are also facing the challenges of variants. We've got the Delta variant, we've got the Gamma variant coming from various different geographies, different mutations, so on and so forth. What's your holistic view now? Like, where do we stand? What kind of role are vaccines playing, both in political perspective, in a health perspective, and how has health become this sort of core argument of global geopolitics at the moment? And we've not seen this before, right? It's always been a very, so to speak, hard politics that leads geopolitics globally. It's either diplomacy, or it's either geography, it's borders, and so on and so forth. But right now we see health at the epicenter. So what's your general take on where we stand at the moment?
Good morning. Thank you, Kabir, and other colleagues for this opportunity. I'll try to be brief and also try to make 4 short points to frame the discussion and contextualize it, while my more qualified colleagues here will share their analysis of the South and Southeast Asia situation, India's neighborhood first policy, and the politics of vaccine diplomacy per se, and of course how China is occupying the vacuum created in the region by India, currently being unable to fulfill its vaccine commitments to the neighbors. Firstly, people may say that so far as India is concerned, vaccine diplomacy needs to be talked about in the past sense. We haven't been exporting vaccines from mid-April onwards. That's wrong. Despite the fact that India has not exported vaccines in a while, India still has enormous production capacity to cater to the world. Only that the surging need during the second wave overwhelmed that production capacity. Also, at that time, the initial months of 2021, there was a demand deficit in India, a situation that surprisingly we are soon likely to reach as cases and deaths go down and people's individual threat perceptions come down. For example, I heard last week that the Tata Memorial Hospital could not even administer half the number of vaccine shots available with them over the week. So surplus availability for export may be a reality much sooner than we think in India. In addition, we have vaccine production capacity itself being expanded on a war footing, and more possible vaccine candidates are coming into play in the coming months. Secondly, India showed admirable political will at the beginning of the year to export vaccines, and it took a considerable political risk domestically, sticking to the principle of Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam for as long as it could. This decision was perhaps also fueled by the feeling particularly among experts. In the January-March quarter, about the pandemic itself being over in India, high seroprevalence levels in cities and a low plateau of cases, despite elections and mass religious gatherings, tricked a lot of people into thinking that a huge third wave is not a real possibility. And a slow rollout of vaccines within the country in line with the existing delivery capacity will do, instead of expanding the delivery capacity itself that we are witnessing now. Our vaccine Maitri efforts earlier this year were in a way born out of the assessment of limited domestic requirement in the weeks and months to come, which was proven wrong. India's vaccine diplomacy effort was, in a way, a big bet on the possibility of there being no third wave immediately. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Thirdly, we need to look at the enormous supply requirements of India as a nation. Even when exports are completely non existent and all the vaccines produced in the country are used within the country, India has administered only about 11% of the world's COVID vaccinations, but it has around 18% of the world's population. As of today, the world has administered just about 3 billion doses of the COVID vaccine, and there is a clear global shortage. Understandably, despite using domestic production capacity exclusively for domestic use, India has fully vaccinated only under 5% of its population and gave one dose to around 21% of the population. Fourthly and lastly, most of what we usually used to call vaccine diplomacy in the first few months of 2021 was just trade and not any predetermined diplomacy effort per se. India is called the pharmacy of the world because of its ability to mass produce relatively cheaper drugs, and it is by extension a vaccine superpower in the sense it can produce large number of doses at low cost. One needs to add that almost all the COVID vaccine manufacturing in India is spearheaded by private enterprise. All the three heads under which India exported vaccine, that is grants, commercial exports, and COVAX, were dominated by Serum Institute. Grants constituted just 16% of the total, and these were doses distributed by the government of India worldwide after purchasing them primarily from the Serum Institute itself. The other two categories, exports and COVAX, were primarily contract commitments of a private enterprise to the rest of the world. In the situation of low number of cases and deaths, Government of India decided to respect these commitments and did not de facto nationalize the vaccines produced within its borders, for which it was congratulated and it was admired for it for a while. Other than that, the government had very little to do with these contractual obligations to begin with. But this small footprint of vaccine diplomacy may soon change as more vaccine doses are available in the country as a result of capacity expansion as well as low demand. I mean, we are seeing surges of vaccine hesitancy in pockets, particularly when the case and mortality threat is going down. I think as time progresses, vaccine diplomacy should go beyond mere production and export of vaccine doses. The experience of vaccinating large number of people in low income settings is an equally important contribution India will make to the world. By making the COVID software open source, India has announced to the world that it is willing to actively share its experience. So with these points, I stop and I'll be happy to discuss further as we proceed and in the Q&A session as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Uman. Some really great points raised, and we'll come back on those during the discussion section. I'll very quickly move to Sohini. Sohini, Uman brought up a lot of interesting points about what a framework of vaccine diplomacy seems to be, right? So it's often a countries purchasing vaccines just from a provider. So it's not necessarily diplomacy. It's literally, as Umar said, it's just trade. It's between a company and a state, and the country where that company is happens to be just a byproduct of that deal. Uh, you have done a report also recently on this. India's neighborhood is something where a large chunk of Indian diplomatic push and efforts is spent on, and that's always been a very sort of contested take of how much India is absorbed within its neighborhood, which doesn't allow it to go beyond the point. But of course, we've seen with vaccine diplomacy, from everywhere from Africa, which has a very low which has very low numbers of vaccinations at the moment, to Latin America, to South America, places where we haven't really, heard of as far as diplomacy goes, are now sort of mainstream, so to speak. But of course, a core of it remains South Asia, right? So the core of it remains around India. What do you think? How has India dealt with both, the idea of being the world's pharmacy and providing everyone with the vaccinations, and balancing that out with a sudden domestic increase in both demand and perceptions, right? Of why are you sending it abroad? And India managed to balance that in its neighborhood, which is the most critical part of its foreign policy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Kabir. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. So, as Kabir has said, I will be speaking today on India's vaccine diplomacy in its neighborhood, which essentially refers to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Thailand. Now, as all of you know, in January this year, India started its Vaccine Maitri initiative, under which it began to provide COVID-19 vaccines to countries across the world. Now, if we have a look at the table on vaccine supply that is available on the website of the Ministry of External Affairs, we will see a chronological list of 93 countries to which India has provided vaccines. Now, of these 93 countries, those in its neighborhood rank amongst the top 8, and Afghanistan at number 18. This indicates that India had prioritized its neighborhood, and indeed, the country has supplied 29% of its total vaccine outreach to the neighborhood alone. Now, what explains this gesture? Now, after all, bilateral assistance is not altruistic, right? It is a manifestation of strategic interests. And if it is so, how have India's interests been served with its vaccine outreach? And in present circumstances, have these interests been negatively affected with India compelled to halt the supply? These are the questions I will be deliberating upon with regard to Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. You may think this is an odd collection, but my selection is based on the fact that India enjoys favorable ties and goodwill with three amongst these countries and not so with the fourth one. Hence, it would be interesting, to explore how India has fared in its vaccine diplomacy with countries it has contrasting relationships with, and what are going to be the future prospects. Before we delve into country perspectives individually, let's say from a holistic point of view, the strategic motivation which belies India's initiative of putting its neighborhood first is its understanding of itself as the net security provider of this region. What does this mean? This means that it refers to India's aspiration of taking a leading strategic role in the Indian Ocean region by nurturing strong strategic bonds with the countries of the region, of course, including those in its neighborhood. Right? Now, it therefore aims to contain problems which affect these countries and itself and ensure regional stability. India therefore undertook the responsibility to cater to the vaccine requirements of its neighborhood, and it was absolutely ably suited to do so, as Oommen has said, as the pharmacy of the world. Now, having understood this strategic perspective, Bangladesh, which is regarded as, we are moving on to the countries now, Bangladesh, which is regarded as India's closest alliance in the region, was the first and also the largest beneficiary of this vaccine outreach. But India's response to Bangladesh's requirements stretched beyond strong diplomatic ties just between the two governments. This is because, as important as it is for the governments of neighboring countries to have favorable impressions of each other, it is also important for the people of neighboring countries to have positive impressions about each other countries, right? So in the past few years, public opinion about India in Muslim majority Bangladesh had suffered owing to the adoption of policies which had ramifications for the Islamic community in India, such as the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register for Citizens. Now, vaccine diplomacy was therefore India's tool to improve its image amongst the Bangladeshi populace, although its overtures were cut short with the onset of the second wave. Now, this led Bangladesh's anxious search for alternatives led it to China. As you know, promised aid remained undelivered. But Bangladesh had once refused China's vaccine, doubting its efficacy. But this time, capitalizing on the urgency, China gifted vaccines to Bangladesh. It has China has for long been trying to cultivate closer ties with Dhaka. Why? To secure its foothold in the Indian Ocean region, to leverage its BRI. And the scarcity of vaccine sources provided the perfect opportunity to not only increase Bangladesh's dependence on it, but also to couch its aid with more coercive undertones. Example, remember the statement China said bilateral ties would be damaged if Bangladesh joined the Quad alliance. The Quad, in which India is a member, is perceived by Beijing to be an anti-China grouping. Hence, the statement conforms to India's apprehensions that China is trying to counter its influence in Bangladesh. But really, until India resumes its vaccine supply, there is not much the country can do about it. Now, for Bangladesh too, the situation is very precarious because it is a small country located between two Asian giants. It tries to maintain meaningful relationships with both. And therefore, Bangladesh's diplomatic skills are now at test, as on one hand, it is trying to stand by India in the hour of crisis. On the other hand, it is trying to maneuver its growing dependence on China. But this diplomatic fix is likely to ease with USA stepping in as an alternate source of vaccine. Now let's just briefly move on to Sri Lanka. Like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka had also been completely dependent on India for its vaccine supply, and thus faltered as the supply suddenly stopped. But Sri Lanka has been deeply sympathetic to India's cause, and although it has been unable to send any physical help, it has honored bilateral ties. How? Because it has explained India's crisis to its citizens to guard against any negative public opinion. Nonetheless, Sri Lanka has also opened its gates to alternate sources: China, Russia, USA. Now, this is not surprising because after the Rajapaksa experience with China on the Hambantota port, it is natural that Sri Lanka's present regime would like to keep its dependence diversified. And indeed, unlike Bangladesh, it has managed to avoid a situation where China is its sole vaccine provider. Now, finally, I move on to Afghanistan. Afghanistan bears favorable goodwill to India, but the story of this vaccine diplomacy will not be complete without bringing in the Pakistani perspective. India has been one of Afghanistan's most trusted developmental partner. And although Afghanistan significantly lacks medical infrastructure, it received vaccines from India. This was its hope in the COVID crisis. But the sudden halt has again caused China to fill in the gap. And how can we interpret China's efforts? As an attempt to influence the ongoing peace process which will determine Afghanistan's fate. Hence, it has also been inviting the Taliban for peace talks. It is supported in this endeavor by Pakistan, which also favors Taliban, and has brought upon itself the role of being a facilitator for this peace process. But Pakistan resists India's involvement in the same. And it is also in a situation to leverage India's halted vaccine supply to its advantage. The pandemic could really have been an ideal opportunity for India and Pakistan to rekindle their ties, which have really dwindled in the past few years. But Pakistan has remained missing from India's list of bilateral outreach. Pakistan's offer of assistance to India is colored by underlying motivations, such as the release of Kashmiri prisoners. And as India is unlikely to take this offer, the situation is in a stalemate without a resolution in near sight. Therefore, to conclude, I would like to say that in view of these developments in the neighborhood, it may be observed that countries which share amicable ties with India, although the halted vaccine supply was a significant letdown, the goodwill still prevails. For Pakistan, on the contrary, it has been an opportunity to press its advantage. But what is most concerning is that the vaccine vacuum India left behind has been catalytically used by China to assert its presence in these countries. This adds to India's existing apprehensions about China countering its preeminence in the neighborhood, especially in an atmosphere where its credibility, as we have discussed, as the net security provider in this region, is being questioned. Recent media updates about fake vaccine camps in India further compromises this credibility. But hopefully, the situation will change soon if India resumes its vaccine campaign. Thank you.
Thanks, Sohini. There are lots of great points raised in your presentation, and we'll come back to those in some time. I'll very quickly move to Shriparna. Shriparna, we've done work on vaccine diplomacy, especially relating to Southeast Asia. And, people perhaps were very, involved in what was happening in Galwan on the India-China border in Ladakh over the past couple of months. And of course, Pakistan is something where we are always obsessed 24/7. But India's other border with Myanmar has also been a cause of concern over the past couple of months, especially with the coup happening in Myanmar and so on and so forth. What kind of approach and outreach has India done in Southeast Asia, specifically Myanmar, and how has that been received not in the region per se, but specifically in Myanmar, because that's one relation we don't hear a lot about. So what was India's outreach like in these parts of the world?
Thank you, Kabir, for raising a very pertinent, I think, issue, because yes, we do not hear much of what is happening in Myanmar, and we know there is a coup, and perception is currently sort of distorted as of yet. So today I'll be touching upon nations, if I may say, because since you just mentioned that I have written on the Southeast Asian neighbors like Thailand, I will like to emphasizing the importance of Indian vaccine diplomacy within the region, because I will also be looking at the Himalayan nations of Nepal and Bhutan as well. Then India has played an intrinsic role in Nepal and Bhutan's vaccination program through its Vaccine Maitri initiative by being the first nation to respond and give Oxford AstraZeneca Covishield vaccine by the Serum Institute of India, Pune, to help these nations begin their vaccination rollout process. The vaccines reached the respective nations by the midweek of January, and by the end of January, each nation had begun its vaccination program with a focus on vaccinating the frontline workers, the health workers, and subsequently going to the elderly population and finally vaccinating their own population. So while I may say that both Nepal and Bhutan fared seemingly well in its vaccination drives, the Southeast Asian nations were hit by their own political arrangements. With respect to Myanmar, the question that you were raising, the February 2021 coup muddled much of the comprehensive plans laid by the then government, the National League for Democracy, to limit the spread of the virus. 2 days after the military takeover on 3, health workers and civil servants across the national civil disobedience movement, rather the CDM, in opposition to the regime. The following weeks witnessed the country's doctors and nurses joining the CDM. In retaliation, the junta launched various violent attacks on healthcare workers. If I give you a data of covering a 3 months period, like from February to May, it shows that there have been more than 170 incidences of assaults on health professionals. Ambulances have been vandalized. Hospitals have been raided, bombed, or occupied by military troops. Even the anti-coup protesters who were wounded, they were, not given proper treatment because Janta wanted them not to be treated by the doctors. If you consider from the end of April till May, there has been arrest warrants which were issued to around 400 doctors for their alleged participation in the CDM. Such incidences have impacted both the testing capacity and the vaccination drive. The day before the coup, Myanmar had logged just over 140,000 cases and there were around 3,000 deaths. But as of 23rd April, more than 1.5 million people had received the first dose, but only 3 lakh had received both doses. Many people, including healthcare workers, are in hiding for fear of being arrested, as many were unable to take their second dose. 1.6 million vaccine doses ended up being wasted, and India had supplied 3.7 million doses. So half of them went to waste. While the junta has urged people to get vaccinated, the arrests, the attacks on health professionals have naturally limited the number of those who can administer the vaccine or who want the vaccines to be administered to them. As was feared, recently the country is struck by its third wave. As if we look at the end of June, 20 township states and regions have been placed under pandemic-related stay-at-home orders by the military. Outbreaks have been reported in Yangon, Mandalay, and the testing capacity before the coup was actually 25,000 per day, which came down to 1,500 a day or 2,000 maximum a day. Now it is slowly rising to 9,400 a day. But health experts are fearing that many more cases and the various presence of Delta, Alpha, and Kappa variants have been discovered, and it is currently in a sway of complete disorder, the situation. So the junta has ignored plans to prioritize vaccination programs. The minister to provide details about its vaccination program prompted COVAX, the global vaccine sharing program, to deployment of 5.5 million doses in March. Thus, the country is currently in dire need to restart its vaccine initiative. As India got hit by the second wave, China has come by providing 5 lakh vaccines in May. However, there is a growing public resentment against China since it shielded Myanmar against reprimand in the UNHC. And anti-coup sections of the Myanmar population are skeptical of the China-made vaccines. However, contrasting China, India has not faced any serious backlash from the public, as its involvement in the region is not viewed as coercive as China's. So, if we hope that India is going to begin its, exporting vaccines soon, then Myanmar will be too willing to, adhere to that, because health comes first, and that is something which the military government has to, understand and put in order so that the flow is not disrupted anymore. Now, if I look at the other Southeast Asian neighbor, that is Thailand, that it's the military-backed government's vaccine strategy has been criticized severely because because of its inability to secure adequate vaccine doses, as the nation was hit by the third wave from January onwards. So the public disapproves the government's decision to not join COVAX. Thailand put its complete bet instead on a direct tie-up between the AstraZeneca and Royal-owned Siam Bioscience concerns, which the concerns arose about the production capacity of Siam Bioscience with AstraZeneca vaccine, and Thailand was also being supplemented by China's Sinovac vaccine. Moreover, when Thailand was unable to fulfill the need, and it was its vaccination drive got delayed, and it just started last month. That time there were media reports that which indicated that India had offered to sell around 2 million doses of vaccine in January itself, but the Thai government refused the offer. I think that was probably because they thought that they will be able to produce more from their end, which actually did not take place. To be sure, Thailand was among the countries that sent relief aid. Second wave hit the country. The assistance is not unexpected as India figures in Thailand's Look West policy and is regarded as a rising market. Thailand is currently racing to secure vaccines for its mass immunization campaign that I just said it began in June. The program now is heavily relying on the reserve 61 million doses of locally made AstraZeneca vaccine, but the government is trying to diversify its nearly and it's targeting to acquire 100 million doses by the end of this year. So it has appealed to USA, it has appealed to Russia, it has also appealed to South Korea, who has supplemented some vaccines to Thailand, but China has been the first to fill the gap. Again, China has supplied 6.5 million doses of Sinovac, and also recently it provided around 5 lakhs, which to not only vaccinate the population of Thailand citizens, so the Chinese nationals who are currently living in the Thailand soil. So, India again starting its vaccination drive will again be helpful for Thailand also to meet its requirement. Now, if I go to the Himalayan neighbors, the governments have been, I think, scrambling to vaccinate. Once India stopped its vaccine export in cases, what remained was a completely disoriented Himalayan neighborhood that had no other option but to appeal to other nations. If you look at Nepal, then 2% of the overall population has been completely vaccinated, but 1.4 million doses have been required immediately to cover at least a few of the second doses that have been pending. Circumstantially, many countries have extended a helping hand, the first and foremost among them again being China, who has granted Nepal around 0.8 million doses of Sinopharm vaccine. Apart from this, an additional 4 million vaccine have been decided to be purchased from China under a non-disclosure agreement. The United States of America has also supplied approximately 7 million doses of its vaccine to Asia, within which Nepal is also featuring, and Nepal will be also getting the grant. Now, if I move to Bhutan, our next Himalayan neighbor, then Bhutan is also trying to make its end meet. While the nation has vaccinated 93% of its adult population from the doses which it got from India, the prescribed gap between the first and the second dose at 16 weeks runs out in mid-June. So Bhutan has been running from pillar to post to arrange that sort of vaccination so that it is able to meet its need. So while the global COVAX alliance has promised to send 20% of Bhutan of AstraZeneca vaccines, these might only be delivered by August. But on a positive note, the European Council, under the Civil Protection Mechanism, has stepped in to help supply the much-needed 500,000 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine. So this vaccine will allow Bhutan to complete its second round of inoculation after India, which had provided enough vaccine for the first round, could complete. So as of now, I believe the main remains, if I look at all the 4 nations, the main challenge that remains is the procurement and the administration of the vaccines to its population. While they are, I think, running pillar to post to arrange the set other vaccinations, but I think vaccination program will now come either yearly or in 2 years. So there is a time limit set to which vaccinations will be able to be administered to its population. So I think procurement, administration of the vaccines should go hand in hand. It should not be, it should not be kept aside. So while India is currently recovering from its surge of cases and deaths, I think as the COVID-19 vaccination program around the world is barely beginning, New Delhi is learning from its slip-ups and coping with its dire domestic challenges better. And it may recommence its vaccine diplomacy in a matter of few months, which will be helpful to its neighborhood. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Suparna. There are some excellent points made specifically on issues in Southeast Asia, which we don't get to hear a lot. So thanks for your comments. I'll very quickly move to now Kalpit. Kalpit, you, of course, look at ground zero of the whole COVID pandemic story. We have actually heard very little about how China managed to cope inside. right? So it's been a very controlled narrative of how China has managed its cases or managed its deaths. The numbers are, of course, you never know whether they are actually correct or not. And of course, the perception of what China portrays outside over its pandemic response is could be different to what's actually happened inside it in certain parts of the country. But they also have pushed through their vaccination programs fairly hard, specifically in geopolitical vacuums where, let's say, a certain country was supposed to get Covishield from a manufacturer either in Europe or in India and is unable to get it. That's where China seems to very quickly place itself. How do you see China balancing this out as a country where the origins of the coronavirus exist, and that is where they came from, which also China took a big hit on its sort of image globally, considering it's been going on for a year and a half now, but we barely sort of now hear about what the Chinese response has been or how China is dealing with it. But most of the narrative is how China is providing its own vaccines to countries that are falling behind, so to speak. So how do you see China placed in this entire amalgamation of diplomacy around vaccines, specifically as a country of origin where this all started?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kabir. And I'll quickly start with, I'll just give an overview of the whole China's vaccine diplomacy. See, this is a year when China is, the Communist Party is celebrating its 100th anniversary, its 100th birthday. So if you kind of glean through Chinese media, you find two things very prominent. One is there is a discussion on what are the past achievements or the domestic achievements of the Communist Party of China, and what are the international achievements in terms of its this is how I perceive it, as its regime legitimacy. So, the Chinese government has announced that it has provided about 350 million doses of vaccines to the international community, and vaccine assistance to over 80 nations, and exports of drugs to over 40 countries. Now, this is being seen as a very, very big achievement, given there is also a kind of a canvassing that despite its huge population, China has been going all out. So about 37 nations in the Asia-Pacific region have received the Chinese vaccines. This is followed by about 33 nations in Africa and 18 nations in South America. Now, very significantly, the People's Liberation Army has also got into the act with it donating medicines and it donating vaccines to, again, militaries in nations which it considers as strategically important. These are in Cambodia, Mongolia, of course, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Ethiopia. Now, Sinovac is one of the main suppliers of vaccines, and it has sold about 525 million doses. Sinovac has conducted trials in namely Indonesia, I mean the prominent being Indonesia, Brazil, and Chile. And again, these nations have purchased about, like Indonesia has purchased about 140 million doses, and followed by Brazil, which has purchased about 100 million, and Chile, which has purchased about 62 million of the doses of Sinovac, or the Sinovac vaccine. Now, Sinopharm has conducted trials prominently in UAE, Egypt, and Morocco. And again, these countries, UAE has purchased about 18 million, Egypt has purchased about 20 million, and Morocco about 10 million. So, we've seen a correlation between the clinical trials that have been happening and the purchase orders. And now another company, another vaccine manufacturer, CanSino or CanSino is helping other nations to set up production facilities. Now, I'll quickly, talk about. I mean, this is something which I think my colleagues have covered, but I will talk about a very different parameter. Now, China has been extremely eager to make inroads in South Asia, and we've seen that both Bangladesh and Sri Lanka turned to China for its COVID vaccines after India had to suspend exports due to the domestic the surge in cases here. So in May, very significantly, China gave about 1.1 million doses of Sinopharm to Sri Lanka, and it donated about 500,000 vaccines to Bangladesh. Now, these vaccinations, these Chinese vaccines restarted the inoculation drives that had been stalled, after supplies from India dried up. So yes, in one way, this suspension, India's suspension of exports, seemed like a very big strategic opportunity for Beijing. In fact, Foreign Minister Wang Yi then got into the act, and he, offered to set up a reserve, emergency reserve for vaccines in South Asia. The question really I want to pose is that has China's soft power outreach? I mean, the whole idea behind this is a soft power outreach, because let's remember that Wuhan was the epicenter of it's the origin of the virus. And with respect to that, has its vaccine diplomacy paid off in these nations? Now, take the case of Bangladesh. At the height of the second wave, Foreign Minister Abdul Momin, made a very passionate appeal to get vaccines either from the West, China, or Russia. Now, China does very promptly answer this call, but subsequently, this is what even my colleagues have pointed out, that the Chinese ambassador warns Bangladesh that this is warns against any move to join the Quad, and that this will damage its relations with China. Now, this again, there has been a sort of a domestic backlash against this. Let's move on to Nepal. Now, China was extremely unhappy after reports emerged that some media outlets disclosed the price at which Sinopharm vaccine was procured. Now, China communicated its displeasure to, I mean, in so many words, it communicated its displeasure to the Nepalese government. Now, Sinopharm has proposed a kind of a non-disclosure agreement with the Nepalese government to keep details regarding the price and delivery a secret. Now, again, reports in Sri Lanka, there have been reports in Sri Lanka and that Sri Lanka had to pay a higher price than Bangladesh for Sinopharm. Now, this has again sparked off a furor. Primarily, also the whole aspect of look at the whole aspect in Nepal, where a private manufacturer, a corporate, is dictating terms to a government, and finally a government is really answerable to its people. So to use a very tough situation and put a government in a spot. So now, really, one thing that has come out of these episodes, and this reveals China's kind of a lack of finesse in its art of soft power. Now, there are perceptions that China has used its vaccine diplomacy to improve its which involves propaganda, and it is to create this image as a generous and a responsible power. Now, look at what has appeared in the Chinese media. Chinese newspapers and the state-controlled media have reported on almost every vaccine shipment, and there is a very standard photo of a cargo plane landing, and senior officials or senior leaders in the concerned nations kind of welcoming this shipment, and these are always accompanied by Chinese diplomatic staff. So to sum up, I think China needs to realize that government propaganda is not a successful strategy to increase its soft power. In fact, to conclude, China has to realize that its soft power has to be subtle, and any impression, that it is chasing propaganda victories is really counterproductive to China. Thank you.
Kabir, you are on mute.
I mean, it's only been 18 months, but so so we have covered a lot of ground over the past sort of 45-50 minutes, and I'm just going to start fielding a few questions to the panel. Please feel free for anyone to step in to answer some of the queries that I have. But I'll just start with Oomen. Oomen, in your comments, you mentioned something very interesting, which is political risk, right? So we are talking about, I mean, very few people, because no one has gone through such a pandemic in our lifetimes, at least, or even maybe the previous generation's lifetime. So the whole idea of political risk is comparatively new, right? Because this is sort of reaching from the very base of politics in India, where everyone is equally sort of getting affected by the virus. How do you see sort of something like vaccine diplomacy, which which started with a lot of confidence in the beginning, because we of course, the cases were rising, but it was not exponential in India at that time. And then, the second wave came and everything changed sort of within a week's time. And that, of course, it also played in the fact that what was happening on the ground in cities like Delhi, which was getting aired sort of globally by media coverage and stuff like that. So how do you see sort of, political risk playing a role in the future of how India is going to approach vaccine diplomacy? Is it going to be much more stymied in its approach and much more careful in its approach, or is it going to come back to that sort of level that this is a critical import from an Indian point of view?
Thanks, Kabir. I think, at the beginning of the year, the risk was amplified by the limited capacity to produce that we had. And also, our calculations went wrong in terms of our risk as a society. And these two combined together shot up the demand for vaccines, which didn't exist in the beginning. I mean, an assumption of our decision to export was that the domestic absorption capacity will be limited, because people were of two minds whether to get vaccinated or not. So many of these things have changed, and most of the, in at least in urban areas, some urban areas, people who will willingly be vaccinated have got their first dose by now, or maybe in the next couple of months. We will see there will be a plateau of demand. So that is there. And also domestic risk, political risk is also a function of how polarized the situation, the debate itself is. Unfortunately, COVID has been politicized on media and platforms. At least there was some, at least in the first wave, there was collaboration between adversarial governments at the backstage, but at the front there was a polarized debate, and many of these things are going to change because the supply will expand. And also now we will see America fulfilling its domestic demand requirements and getting into the field. So India's anxiety about China occupying the space around it will be mitigated in a way with America getting into the act. Last week, America has sent vaccines to South Asia through COVAX, and America is partnering with India through the Quad plans around vaccines, but it has a very realistic timeline of 2022. 1 billion doses by 2022 is what it said, but nevertheless, Indian capacity to produce is getting expanded. So that direness of a need may not be there going forward. So the risk will be there, but then it won't be as acute
Right.
as it was earlier.
Right. And I'm just going to continue the whole ideation of political risk and sort of move it to the neighborhood, right? Because that is a large, I mean, we of course see, we often see foreign policy as a technical subject. So it's a bit distant from the political demands of a country's domestic politics, especially like India, and what is happening from a foreign policy perspective. At least that's the sort of general view of how foreign policy is looked upon in India still. But when you're talking about something like health, when you're talking something like a pandemic which does not, of course, abide by our understandings of geographical borders and so on, I just wanted to ask both Sriparna and Sohini, from a South Asian or a border point of view. We've seen, for example, when the coup happened in Myanmar, a lot of at least some Northeast Indian states said, look, we have to take some of these people in because we have historical cultural ties with them. Now, whether or not a pandemic is there or not seemed quite irrelevant at that point of time because there was a conflict situation happening. And of course, you also mentioned that, there are challenges, there was a lot of wastage when the vaccines were eventually given. So there are these fraction points that we have on our borders. So from both you, Sriparna and Sohini, from the neighborhood perspective, it's much more than just, oh, well, there's a pandemic happening right now, so everything has to revolve around that as far as policy goes. We saw that some of the Northeast Indian states were like, well, despite the center's push that do not take people coming in from the Myanmarese conflict into your territory, they still did because it's what they had to do, considering cultural relations and so on and so forth. So what do you think, how is political risk perceived on Indian borders in South Asia when it comes to the pandemic, right? So of course, we see it from one perspective is the vaccines, right? And that comes down to a country's ability to administer them. We can deliver it to them, or anyone can deliver, but administration comes down to that. But India also has to respond to such crises on the border, while now both taking into account the pandemic and the political situation. So how do you see the pandemic sort of changing this, if at all, on sort of within the South Asian periphery? So it's either to Sohini or Sriparna.
Sriparna, I think you go first on this.
Am I audible? Yeah. So I think when the pandemic arose, and as Kabir, you rightly pointed out, due to the coup, there have been a section of population that have been wanting to escape. Even doctors, even police officers, they have escaped, tried to escape from their nation because they did not want to, stay in such an arrangement, such an disarray of the situation that they were put in. And while we saw that, there were around more than, I think, 20,000 or 30,000 more people were there stranded in the border areas to gain entry into India. And we know that there are ethnic ties between the Chin state and the other side of the border, and that is the reason why the state allowed these people to come in, while the center kept on saying that they have to maintain this diplomatic ties with Myanmar, and they wanted to send them back to Myanmar. But the state government this time, they stood up and they said that no, I don't think the situation is right, or to send these people back. Even the border, the people in the border area, I mean the border guards, they themselves had stood up and said that they will not allow these people to go back. And the border people in the Myanmar side of the border also, they said that they do not want these people to go back. So yes, there's a lot of political dynamics which are involved. There is ethnic links which is involved, which actually makes this entire gamut, if we look at, a very human gamut, because they do not want these people to go. And the people from that side also, they know the risk of taking these people back. So whether pandemic or not, there is a human angle which came to play very clearly after the after the coup surfaced. So the human angle, I think, won in this, because the state government stood up against the center and said that no, they won't send them back. Also, if you look at from the health perspective, then yes, a lot of bordering states which shares border with Myanmar have been affected by COVID, and there have been shutting off of borders from those areas. But yes, the human factor does exist. So I feel that this thing is something which is very new, and which is very, I think that it shows that humanity does exist. And though foreign policy angle is there, but yes, people are standing up for each other and helping each other out. So that is there in the neighborhood, I feel, especially from the perspective of Myanmar and India.
Right. Tony, do you want to come in, or?
Yeah, just two things. Like, I don't have much to add on this, but just two things. Before the pandemic happened, am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So before the pandemic happened, we had a conference in Pondicherry. Where I was presenting a paper, and that is the department of UMISARC, and it has students coming in from all the SAARC countries. And at that time, I was doing a paper on India's health diplomacy with Afghanistan, which is a very small section of the developmental aid that India provides to Afghanistan. And there was this Afghan boy, and we were just chatting about how things are in his country, because it's very difficult to get a first-hand perspective of Afghanistan. And I asked him that, you have medical aid coming in from so many countries. What is it that sets apart India's aid? Do you think it's better than other countries, or do you think it's not? It's at par with others? And he told me that India, if a medicine is there from India, we know that it is authentic, and we know that we can take it, and it's not fake, it won't harm us. So that element of trust is there. Right. So I think, when, India began its vaccine diplomacy, in the neighborhood itself, there are instances where, China has offered its aid before. But, there have been doubts about its efficacy. Of course, albeit because the pandemic originated from China, there have been doubts about its efficacy. And as long as countries, had the option of choosing alternatives, Chinese vaccine diplomacy did not really make any headway in South Asia. It was only after India halted its vaccine. So I think, regardless of the fact that India's credibility has been questioned, definitely, because it has not been able to supply the vaccine which has been purchased from it. That's a big blow to India's image. But if you come down to what people trust, how the people of India's neighboring countries perceive India, I think that element of trust still exists, and that will, if India can bank on that, and resume its vaccine campaign accordingly, I think that will help India regain what it has lost to a large extent. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Sohini. That's a very important point. And Kalpit, I'll just come to you very quickly. Like Sohini mentioned, I think a lot of places where, especially in South Asia and Southeast Asia till a certain level, a lot of places where the Chinese vaccine has come through over the past couple of months has been due to a lack of option of those states, right? So either they had ordered somewhere and just whether India or in Europe or elsewhere, and those vaccines just didn't make their way due to various sort of waves coming through in Europe and India and so on and so forth. And the only other option was to go for the Chinese vaccine, whether it's bought or donated, being a little irrelevant here. Now, is that playing in favor of China, or is it that actually against China? Right, because of course, if you see a country like Cambodia, for example, which is very deeply rooted in its relations with China, but also a place where Indian manufactured Covishield actually went there, and the top leadership took that Covishield only, and the Chinese vaccine sort of came a little bit later, only because of short of supply. So how does China view its vaccine diplomacy? Is it something that they are plugging gaps with where others are failing, and they are magnifying that aspect that, look, others have failed, we will not fail you? Or is it actually that our vaccine is great, take ours first?
See, Kabir, there are several narratives here. I mean, anybody who's familiar with studying, even when you try to take some of the books, some of the Mandarin books or the textbooks which are prescribed to people who are non-native speakers, you will find very striking thing. You will find this thing regarding Chongyao. Now, Chongyao means Chinese medicine, the ancient Chinese medicine. So you'll find essay after essay in very rudimentary text, even for learners who are trying to learn Mandarin, that this Chongyao or Chinese medicine is much more superior to Western medicine. So this is one of the narratives, and China has tried to push that narrative even further with its with the entire with its vaccine diplomacy. Now, see, it's very obvious that nations will prefer Western medicine. Now, I'll just point this out to you. There is a poll there was a poll in which was conducted very recently in the Philippines. Now, in the Philippines, there were only about 19% of or 20% of the respondents who were asked said they were willing to be vaccinated. Now, out of this 20%, only 13% say that they really they trusted Chinese medicine. And in fact, 40% said that despite their socioeconomic conditions, they would prefer a US or a Western vaccine. Now, this speaks a lot about China. Another statistic which I wanted to make this point earlier, but another statistic is a very jarring kind of a thing. You see, China started its vaccination drive around mid-March, and that China had administered only about 65 million doses by mid-March, and in fact, in April it was giving about 4.8 million doses. But given China's, the size of China's population, about 40. These are WHO figures. China, there will be a different set of Chinese figures. I'm not going into that, but the WHO says that about 45% of China's population has received the first jab, and about 16% of China's population is completely vaccinated. Now, look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong, it's only about 21% of its population has been fully vaccinated. So there is a huge issue internally about Chinese vaccines. There is a lot of hesitancy. There are, this is again, this has been reported by Chinese media itself. There have been cases where the Chinese government in different parts of in different villages or in the hinterland has been giving monetary incentives, or it is even known to supply weed to some of the people who want to take the vaccine. So here it is, it almost seems like China is trying to make a case for its own vaccines internally.
Right. Okay. That's a very interesting point, and you mentioned hesitancy. And Oman, I'll just come to you very quickly. It's the whole concept of vaccine hesitancy was, of course, it's sort of not aligned with the vaccine diplomacy, so to speak. Right. I mean, it's a very sort of localized issue in a particular geography, and that geography could be anything. But like, for example, we saw this whole thing playing out where the Indian Covishield was suddenly deemed as something slightly different from the European Covishield, that you can't travel suddenly and you need separate sort of licensing or paperwork done from the SIS perspective. And we also saw that some Indian manufactured Covishield that was provided to the United Kingdom, and people were given those vaccines in the UK, were told, like, check your batch numbers and see if you can actually travel to mainland Europe or not, because SII manufactured sort of vaccines were being questioned. How do you see sort of this vaccine hesitancy also playing out from a domestic political perspective? Right, I've seen people. It has nothing to do with education. I think I've seen people within our ecosystem also saying, I'm not going to take it because I don't know what's in it, or what is it going to be, and so on and so forth. And when we're talking about vaccination numbers, percentages, which seems to be a metric where a country can say, look, we have done 50%. That means we are ahead of everyone else, and it's fine to open up travel, whatever it is. How do you see sort of hesitancy playing out as far as being part of vaccine diplomacy is concerned?
See, vaccine hesitancy at the domestic front, I mean, it is also dependent on perceptions, but vaccine hesitancy at the domestic front, I mean, I will segregate them into two. One is in the rural areas. I mean, people are not informed enough, and they generally are anxious about getting a jab from the nearby hospital, and there are these rumors spreading it will affect reproductive health and whatnot. And as I said earlier, the polarized debate isn't helping. And the second one is about an individual's own assessment about his or her own risk. I mean, you see that, okay, vaccine, if I take a jab, it will have a certain chance of a side effect. But I mean, most of the people I have seen who have been infected had a minor fever and they got over it. So I mean, there are two ways of getting immunity, right? One is the desirable way of a vaccine, and the second is an undesirable way of through infection of the virus itself. So for many people, the infection itself is not such a bad bet to make. Right. I mean, they don't mind being carriers, and from a societal perspective, they can be spreaders, and they don't care about it. So that kind of hesitancy is very hard to overcome. So that is the domestic front. The global one is about perception. I mean, as you said, Chinese people were hesitant to take Chinese vaccines because over the last 3 years, 4 years, there have been many scams around vaccine manufacturing in China. So that is a broader perception, which is based on, sometimes it is based on facts, sometimes it is perception feeding perception. But in China's case, that is a real threat. In India's case, I mean, we were a little too fast in approving some of our vaccines, and it has affected perception, but that has led to vaccine hesitancy among the more informed lot. I mean, the health workers, for example.
Right.
Many people were waiting it out for the data to come in. Now, I mean, most people will now go and get the jab. Right. So going forward, I think most people in India have been vaccinated by infection. Some of them have been vaccinated by vaccine. So we won't see a huge spike in cases driving demand now. So we will hit a plateau in terms of demand very soon, where people who are willing to get vaccinated are already vaccinated. Now it's a long game of persuasion and so on and so forth. So hesitancy is going to become a prominent problem for India, and this hesitancy may be seen as something positive from a policy perspective, so that we can export the freedom vaccines. So it is a very complex state of play.
Right. And I know I'll just add before we take a couple of questions from our listeners and people who are watching this. There's something I can't remember if it was Sriparna or Sohini who mentioned that how vaccine diplomacy, especially in the neighborhood, is a sort of component of soft power, and how it sort of, it can get affected as part of diplomacy if you do not end up being a stable provider within your neighborhood, right? As a big country. Now, I just want to it's a very fundamental question, considering what we have all, I mean, not just us, everyone on the planet has gone through in the past 1.5 years, which has been, for the lack of the overused term, unprecedented in almost every factor. Do you still see, from a geopolitical perspective, as vaccines actually still being soft power, or is it much more than that now? It's actually hangs somewhere between soft and hard power, because if any country tomorrow that has, let's say, is in reliance on one country to be provided vaccines, and that one country can unanimously decide for whatever reason, whether it be shortage or whether it be by design, that no, we are unable to provide to you. Where does that put vaccine diplomacy within sort of IR frameworks that we keep studying of soft and hard? Does that change anything?
Yeah, Shuparnadi, shall I go first?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I think that is a very interesting point. But as you said, this is as novel as the virus, as it's the experience is as new as that. So we are also learning, and we as in let's identify ourselves as nations in this neighborhood. So nations are also learning how to cope with it, and they are also learning what can be the diplomatic challenges in this respect. Now, India, as a country, if I say, in its understanding as the role of the net security provider of the region, has always, and I stress on the word always, been a very active and substantial provider of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, right? Which is something which is so important in the Bay of Bengal with its cyclones and tsunamis. And in 2004, if you remember, when the tsunami happened, India was so severely affected itself, it still managed to send, aid to 4 countries simultaneously. So I think that kind of perception about India and its crisis management prevails in the country. It's obvious that India has not completed existing projects and whatever is there, but as far as crisis management is concerned, I think that sort of mindset prevails in the region. So what happened when the second wave plunged India was something totally unprecedented. But then that is when the transformation that you're saying, that soft power to hard power, I think the transformation of vaccine diplomacy happened then, when countries realized that they can no longer continue to depend on only one power, no matter how reliable you consider it to be, because this is something which is important for the country's survival. Economics, politics, all comes later. First, it is important to survive. And that is why we are seeing that despite the hesitancy to accept Chinese vaccines, it is being administered to the people across the countries, because seriously, there is no option. So therefore, I think you're very right, Kabir, that there has been a transition from soft power to hard power as far as the vaccines are concerned in the neighborhood. Definitely.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Sohini. If anyone wants to add on this, please feel free. While I'll just pick a question that we have got, which of course all of you have already mentioned in passing, but I think a little bit more detail is required right now. Is of as far as vaccine diplomacy goes, specifically in Asia, let's say in the coming months, in the running months that are going to come, what role is that section of the Quad going to play in providing vaccines in the region, both from a geopolitical perspective but also from a health perspective, right? Quad is again seen largely as a positioned as a geopolitical and alliance with the commonality of democracy, ideology of democracy being the common binding factor. But of course, it's seen also has a hard power sort of, the military approach to countering Chinese geopolitical influence. Now, where does something like a pandemic play into it? Because the Quad has made statements of providing vaccines through its mandate. So, what do you see as the future of the Quad in the next coming 4-5 months as an institution here? And can a successful Quad initiative over the next 1 year, let's say for the sake of discussion, actually cement a lot of the loose ends that the Quad seems to, at least people are saying, still has, as far as creating an alliance, so to speak, in the coming time in Asia, that is. Anyone can take that. Suparna, on the Quad?
Yeah. So I think if we look at the structure of Quad and the recent group meeting that took place in March 2021, it was decided that in order to ease supplies, the Quad vaccine partnership will work with Biological E Limited of India to finance increased capacity and produce at least 1 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines by the end of 2020 to supplement its global efforts like COVAX. Furthermore, this collaboration is going to fortify the last mile vaccination in the Indo-Pacific. India is actually on its way of recovery, and India has said that it is going to fulfill this target. And I think Quad vaccine partnership will play a major role, which also will supplement global efforts like COVAX in future, because I think it is coming up as the next, field where, Quad is going to be in prominence. So it is going to work out pretty well.
All right. Thanks, Shubhana. I'll just take one more question. And I think, Oman, you may have answered this many times, but since it's been posed again, I'm going to throw it at you. Of course, did India, the whole sort of initial stages of vaccine diplomacy, where India was a net provider, so to speak, was going very well. It was even if you see from the public diplomacy perspective, the pictures of Indian vaccines landing everywhere were being posted and so on and so forth. And the question raised by Nilesh is that did India, the failure of India sort of predicting a second wave, did that undermine all the good work done previous to that, or is that something that can be recoverable, so to speak?
See, if we had predicted our second wave well, there would be zero vaccine diplomacy. I mean, to put it very crudely, we would have secured whatever we could, and we would have, even prioritized the high-risk individuals. See, the COVID response by design is operating in a situation of uncertainty. So there can't be set templates, set frameworks. So we plan as we go, so to speak. So the counterfactual history wouldn't really help us for anything that we might have to do in the future. So yes, we failed to see the second wave for what it is. But the third wave, there may still be pockets where vulnerable populations are in large numbers. So we might see spikes in certain pockets within India, which will scare people and which will drive up demand. But I don't think, given the kind of seroprevalence levels, and even if we account for breakout infections, the infections that people get after vaccination or after the first infection, the numbers have reached a certain kind of high level that a huge surge may not be possible. So in that sense, our planning will be more certain, and we won't be surprised the way we were last time. That is what I think.
Right. I'll just ask, does anyone else want to step into this question? No? Okay. I'll just, there's another sort of follow-up for Uman on what you just said. And there was Smita Sarkar is basically asking that, so now in where we stand, both in vaccine diplomacy and administrating Indian vaccines and the vaccine that we manufacture within India, how much does the safety net of a well-functioning health infrastructure actually help in diplomacy now? Like, we have, seen shortages, we've seen stopping in manufacturing, we've seen fires in facilities. But so how does the projection of a well-functioning health system and a well-functioning health infrastructure system is critical to a diplomacy program now?
Diplomacy, in the sense, it can have an indirect impact on the perception of the quality of stuff. Other than that, it is a slippery slope. Everybody knows that health system strength is important in a pandemic response. But in the classical way in which we see health security, if we overemphasize that point, it is a double-edged sword, because all these rankings that we have seen over the last 5 years, 10 years, all those countries which have done exceptionally well in terms of health security, preparedness and resilience, they were the ones who got hit worse by this virus. So in that sense, while we know it is necessary and an important factor in the overall scheme of things, it may not be a sufficient condition.
Yeah.
So I don't see a direct linkage between perceptions and the health system preparedness. It is more of a ability of a government or a system to be nimble in its approach.
Right. So let me just carry on the whole concept of perceptions and take it to Sohini and Sriparna from a South Asia point of view, from a neighborhood point of view, so to speak. Right. Of course, like Sohini has said before, India has a pre-existing, goodwill with Afghanistan, and we have very close relations with Bangladesh and so on and so forth. But from a public point of view, do you think in these neighboring countries, from public perception, sort of stepping away from the formalities of diplomacy, and if we see the public perception feeding into a diplomatic narrative, has India lost out, or will there be an understanding of what happened in the second wave in India, and it was sort of required for India to take capacity for domestic consumption instead of honoring most of its export demands?
Sriparna, do you want to go first, or will I go first?
I think you can go first, because we just said Bangladesh. I think you can go first, then I can go.
Yeah. Okay, fine. Yeah, that is right. But as I said, some countries which India has amicable relationships with have tried to guard public perception against India's faltering space to, where it could not supply vaccines. But yes, then again, of course, public perceptions matter a lot, as like government's perceptions of each other matter, public perceptions do matter. And also I would like to bring in this perspective one particular point. Social media is of course there as a medium of communication, and so is media there. But what we have to keep in mind is this is a very connected region as far as the people are concerned. Because it was part of the same country, people share familial ties across borders, cultural ties across borders, and that the impact India's inability to supply vaccines to its own people has been, I think, will have ripples across the neighborhood. Because that is something which will resonate with the people, and this is not some kind of a government agenda. This is on a person-to-person basis. Yeah. I think that is very important. And the second aspect of this is, which I've already mentioned when I was, making my initial remarks, that is that, these incidences of fake vaccines camps which are happening in India, and private firms are being stopped from providing vaccination for a few days. So I think that also will create some kind of perception about the kind of vaccines that the countries will once again start receiving from India. They will, I guess, I think there will be some kind of hesitancy, perhaps, if this localized incidents does spread across the region. That will be another reason why hesitancy will be there in accepting vaccines that they get from India.
All right, thanks, Sripanna. Anything? Can keep it just very quickly. We're running a bit off.
Yeah, I think if I have to pinpoint Nepal and its vaccine requirements, so India and Nepal's relationship has been fraught over the Kalapani issue, and India towards the 2015 blockade that had taken place. So there was this public perception which was sort of negative towards India, and the vaccine diplomacy, when India came to the rescue, it had an impact on its on its people, and they took the India in a much more positive light through this. And both sort of perceptions do remain, and then suddenly India stopping its aid, yes, also has faltered some perception of India. So I think these things are going to happen, because this entire second wave of India and its vaccine diplomacy, it's completely unprecedented. And as I had just said, that the global vaccine agenda is just opening up. So such slip-ups and is going to be there, and then we have to see how it is coming out, and how we are addressing it properly. Yeah, so that's
right. Great point over there. Kalpit, I'll come finally to you, and we're just running short of time. So what is the legacy of China now? Is it the ground zero of the pandemic, or is it a net provider of vaccines? Manufacturing from China to UAE. UAE was one of the first ones to actually administer Sinopharm, I think, if I'm correct. So what's the legacy here, and what's the perception of the Chinese population, which seems to have gone through the entire pandemic fairly unscathed, at least from outside?
Okay. You see, Kabir, there are no straight answers to this. Now, my mind, in fact, my mind goes back to the whole Great Leap Forward, which was initiated by Mao Zedong, and Mao wanted to breach the steel production of China and overtake the US and UK. This is in the mid 50s. Now, Frank Dikötter writes in his book that nearly the death toll. I mean, I don't want to go into what happened. Very simply, farmland was converted into these mobile foundries, where they wanted to kind of. So a lot of farmers were mobilized to produce steel, which was, it's an impossibility. But now, because of that, farming, agricultural production suffered, and the death toll is estimated to be 45 million to 60 million. Now, if this is the kind of death toll that happened in China, and China was able to kind of, any references to that death toll only came out in the 1960s, in the mid 60s. So nearly 10 years later, because information is very tightly controlled in China. We don't. I don't think I can say anything on the deaths, because there's a lot of going on in social, a lot of things going on in social media. Now, coming back to the legacy of this entire thing, I would say trust the ingenuity of the Chinese leadership. Now, two things that really emerge out of this entire thing, and this is a question you had asked earlier too, that why was China successful? Now, if you ask this to any of the Chinese commentators, they will say, well, China was successful, and look at the West. The West with its democracy crumbled.
Yeah.
But I mean, China's socialist system is what actually helped China throughout this pandemic, and hence, the US shouldn't be, preaching to us about democratic values. So these are the kind of, this is, in short, this is the kind of legacy that,
Right.
the pandemic has left for China.
Right. Okay. So thanks everyone for joining in today. We are really at the last minute now, and this is a conversation that is going to continue for months on end. Right now, I mean, the pandemic is not going anywhere. It's going to be part of the polity and society one way or the other in the coming months, at least. There are a lot of such debates to be had in the future. But I would like to thank all my panelists for joining in today and everyone who tuned in on various platforms for this discussion, and hope to see everyone soon. Thank you for joining.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Kabir.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Kabir.
everyone.
Thank you.